I hope, okay. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the International Association of the Schools of Social Work webinar, organized by the IASSW Women's Interest Group on the occasion of March 8th, International Women's Day, when we remember and celebrate women's struggle for equality, equal rights, and social justice. The topic of today's webinar is reproductive rights and social work. Through this webinar, we advocate for sexual health, reproductive rights, and reproductive justice, and support struggles around the world against health and social inequalities. Our exceptional speakers today are Professor Raewyn Connell from University of Sydney. We will change the order a little bit. Professor Beddoe from University of Auckland, Minenhle from University of Johannesburg, Professor Jane McPherson from University of Georgia, US, and Professor Guzmán Stein from University of Costa Rica. The webinar will be moderated by me, Professor Darja Zaviršek, University of Ljubljana, Chair of the IASSW Women's Interest Group. Due to the technical problems, we have a bit change of the order of the speakers. So I would like to invite you, Jane McPherson, to take to be the first presenter. Thank you, Jane.
I will do that. Good morning, everyone. I'm just seeing if I can send out to the rest of the speakers the link that I use to get in and see if we can get everybody on board, but certainly we appreciate all of you being here today. I am going to pull up my slides, which I hadn't opened yet because I didn't know I was going to go first. So let me do that for you, and we will get started. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. All right. So now I will try to get into my slideshow. Good morning. So I just really wanted to begin by saying I'm delighted to be here. Let me pull up my notes. I'm thrilled to be here with wonderful colleagues and sort of to celebrate reproductive rights around the world and in my country. And certainly what's happening in my country, as you all know, I imagine, is that we are experiencing a time of crisis. As a human rights scholar, I strongly support, as I imagine all of us do here as we celebrate International Women's Day, just expanded access to all human rights, including reproductive rights around the world. Today, what I was going to do is really speak very quickly on just what's going on in reproductive rights in the United States. This is such a confusing time for us, and I apologize for my moving screen because I am traveling this morning, so I'm speaking to you from a hotel. But we are in this time of tremendous shifting and changing in the United States. Plus, since reproductive rights are available state by state in the United States, we really have 50 different environments in the United States, which makes it pretty hard to track and understand. Much like human rights in general in the United States, your access to rights is very much dependent on where you stand, as well as how much money you have, what kind of access you have to services in general. But anyway, I'm going to do three things today quickly, giving you an overview of our impossibly complicated system, and then tell you a little bit about how NASW has been responding to the reduction in rights that we have in the United States, and then following up just by pointing at you to some folks who are doing some, I think, cutting edge scholarship on social work, and I hope leading us forward. So So to begin with the crisis, in the United States, the right to abortion was guaranteed by the idea of there being a right to privacy. It was established in a case called Roe v. Wade, and it was overturned in 2022. There was a new case that we refer to as Dobbs, but that's really called Dobbs versus Jackson's Women's Health Organization. It was a case that challenged, as you can see here, a Mississippi ban on abortion at 15 weeks of pregnancy. And the Supreme Court justices had the opportunity to either uphold Roe and allow us to continue to have a right to abortion in the United States, or they could have made a very, very narrow ruling that simply supported this reduction to 15 weeks, but they, in fact, removed any kind of abortion right in the United States. So now 1 in 3 U.S. women are living in states where abortion is not accessible. And even though, of course, up to 1 in 4 women in the United States is expected to have an abortion by age 45. So those two statistics and ideas sit very uncomfortably next to one another, that 1 in 3 women live in a state where abortion is inaccessible, and 1 in 4 women are expected to have an abortion during the course of their lifetime. And since the ruling, 18 states have worked toward more banning. And meanwhile, other states are trying to protect the ban within the state constitution. So it's this super complex setup. And of course, people who are disproportionately excluded and harmed, people, communities of color, communities living in poverty, and trans communities are all particularly excluded and are finding the right to abortion hard to access. Of course, I include this slide of our current Supreme Court because it's really, I think, to me, it is of real relevance that for the 3 of the justices who voted to overturn our reproductive rights in the United States were Trump appointees. So 3 out of the 5. So it's very, very significant move under Trump and towards this kind of what we call a red America. And then you see the dissenting votes. 2 of the women justices and the Chief Justice dissented in the case. So this, it says updated February 10th, but it's actually the most updated version of this. And I just showed it to you from the New York Times. It's very useful because this moves constantly, unfortunately. So as you can see, I am speaking to you from Georgia, and you can see the state where I live, which is abbreviated GA in the bottom right hand of the map. So in my state, abortion is banned after 6 weeks. So of course, most women do not know they're pregnant at 6 weeks. So it is very, very difficult to arrange getting a pregnancy, getting an abortion before 6 weeks. And the other states that are in the darker red, abortion is banned altogether. So of course, this shows you that it's, much of the American South, which is the sort of the post-slavery part of the United States, the very traditionally kind of what we call a states' rights point of view, that states should be able to dissent from the national government. This is where we see the most extreme laws going into effect. And then, but you see now also where this is an expanded version of that map that shows you additionally where we have the full ban, the 6-week ban, and then many other states with bans at 15, 18, or 20 weeks. Then you have the flip side where you see in the stripes where states have moved to prevent a ban. So the politics of the United States are very complicated and local. And then here's the states where abortion is accessible. From my own point of view, it's important to notice that South Carolina is a state where abortion is accessible. So if you are a person in Georgia, you are going to drive to South Carolina. And I just thought I would show you too now what women are doing. So this is a site that is that includes social workers in its operation, but is not a social work site. But this is the abortion finder site that is being shared certainly by many working social workers to their clients. It allows you to enter, as you can see, your address, the date of your last period, and your age to find a provider. So I did that. I'm not, I am certainly 18 years or older, but I just entered the date, I think, of January 2nd yesterday to show you what would look like if I did that. If a woman in my town, which I've put a star around, Athens, Georgia, as I find that the nearest to me is about 80 miles away. It would take you sort of half a day to get there. Unfortunately, also, once you get to South Carolina, there are waiting periods, including for the abortion pill. So if you went to if you went to that site number 1, the closest available space, you would have to take time off work. As you can see, you could click on a link for assistance with cost and travel. Of course, advocates are very clear that, again, this is a tremendous burden on women who are, again, living in the United States where we don't have access to universal health care, where women do not have access to any kind of leave from jobs. So people often are in the place of having to decide between keeping a job and getting abortion care. So it puts people in just a terrible position. So social work, they immediately, this is the day or the day after the decision in 2022. So this is a very new environment for us. And abortion has become over the last several years more restricted by state, but this idea that there is no right to abortion is new within the year. And the National Association of Social Workers has truly come out to say reproductive rights are human rights, and has condemned in the strongest language the decision. However, it is very complicated in the United States right now to be a social worker in some of the states that don't provide these rights, since there's even been talk about, right, as they say, if you read down here, it tells you that in many states, restrictive measures will go so far as to criminalize providers, including social workers, who are simply doing their jobs by supporting a pregnant person. So it puts social workers, and again, it puts social workers of color, particularly women who may not have something to fall back on, into a particularly difficult, position. So just as we look at things intersectionally, things become more and more complicated. And then finally, I wanted to just these are just screenshots of articles that I really recommend looking at social work responses. So one is from 2019 and one from 2021. So both of these articles came out before the Dobbs decision, but both are concerned about the role of reproductive rights in social work education. And because as much as our national organization says, oh yes, we support reproductive rights, that's, I would say our profession is often ambivalent the way that we show up. For some of the reasons I said, for the reasons that social workers are afraid of repercussions, and that goes for educators as well. So you may be following, for example, the governor of Florida, DeSantis is someone who may become president of the United States. And, he very much is looking to punish even professors who speak outside of, his idea of what is correct policy. So it is this idea of really advocating for reproductive rights and social work education is needed. And it's sometimes personally and professionally risky. So how do you sort of square that circle? But the reproductive justice framework is, I think, really, I agree with Jessica Liddell that this is critical. So reproductive justice rather than rights, it's a critical feminist framework that was invented as a response to US reproductive politics. And its three core values are the right to have a child, the right not to have a child, and the right to parent a child or children in safe and healthy environments. So again, a reproductive justice model continues to push for other social and economic rights that we also do not have access to in the United States. We are very unusual in providing no mandatory paid maternity leave. So forced parenthood in the United States context is even more distressing in terms of any kind of ability to build wealth or financial security. So I think the view from the United States at this moment is really pretty grim and difficult, and social workers are being challenged and find themselves in a position that's often between a rock and a hard place. So that is unfortunately the message that I have for all of us today. And I think from my perspective as a human rights scholar, I think that the crisis that we're in shows more and more the importance of social and economic rights altogether. That as we lose access to secure reproductive rights. And certainly there are, advocates are very concerned that the same argument that was made in the Dobbs case will be made to deprive women of access to regular contraception, and also in cases of gay marriage. So we are really experiencing a rollback. So thank you. And I'm sorry for this very bad news on Women's Day.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jane McPherson. You are showing how important it is and to speak up about the reproductive rights, including abortion. And the Women Interest Group and the Human Rights Committee of the IASSW wrote a statement in support of everyone in social work and globally who are supporting this human right this human rights issue. So I hope we will have time that I can read the statement out. So thank you very much. Our next speaker is Liz Beddoe from University of Auckland. She because of the time differences, she sent us the video on which she speaks. So I would like to ask you, please, Rashmi, to play the video made by Liz Beddoe. Rashmi, can you hear me? Okay. Okay, we don't have the voice. I think we need to have the voice too.
This is maximum volume, she.
Can you stop it? And I tried how it works if I do it.
Okay, okay.
Because this is like muted.
I'm Liz Beddoe from the University of Auckland, and I'm really pleased to be able to join this webinar today. I'm sorry I can't be here in person, but I'm very happy to be able to contribute. I bring greetings, kia ora koutou katoa from Aotearoa, New Zealand, from colleagues and friends in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I'm happy to start by talking a little bit about my involvement in this issue and how it came about. It goes back a long way. In the 1970s, as a young undergraduate student, I was involved in some protest activities related to our efforts to get abortion law reform, which were to some extent successful. We did get a legal service established. However, that legislation was very restrictive and very costly, and it took us 40 years to get further reform, which happened in 2020. So it was a long haul to get the next stage of our law reform. When it became apparent that under the Jacinda Ardern government, we would be able to get abortion law reform back in front of our parliament, I got involved again, starting to write some pieces about why we needed reform, very much aimed at social work, but also picked up to some extent by the media. With colleagues in Australia and Ireland, we decided to challenge what we saw as the social work silences on abortion law reform around the world. There were sort of sporadic efforts to raise these issues, but there wasn't a great deal of literature. So I was very inspired by the campaign in Ireland, where social workers, developed a Twitter account and had quite a bit of public activity and worked hard to establish their role in the campaign for law reform in Ireland. So inspired by that, and also by the work of some US colleagues to write in social work venues about abortion and more broadly reproductive justice, I started to do a little bit more, some more writing, some more blogging. And I did meet pushbacks from conservative social workers when I shared stories that had been published or podcasts that were made. I did get people saying that it wasn't appropriate for me to raise this issue in a social work professional forum, even though this was Facebook, and it was a closed group, meant to be a place where we could have conversations about challenges that the profession faced. So I decided in my future work to really clearly frame abortion as a rights issue, as a human rights issue, as a social work issue. And I used for this the principle of empowerment and the right to participate in health decisions. So social workers should promote the full involvement and participation of people in ways that enable them to be empowered in all aspects and decisions affecting their lives. And again, if you look at some of the IFSW policy on health, it's very clear that our role is to empower, not to pass judgment or to put barriers in the way of healthcare. And I was always moved by the idea that rights don't mean very much if we don't have the social conditions in which we can exercise those rights. So rights don't mean much in health if you can't get healthcare. That's just the way it is. And around the time that I started writing and thinking about abortion and reproductive justice, I came across this article, which was published in a social work ethics journal. I'm not going to read this whole quote, but in essence, the author of the piece was suggesting that pro-life churches could recruit young women from among the faith community and get them to volunteer to go to a local abortion service, and claiming to be pregnant, claiming to want an abortion, get an appointment, and then not turn up and just leave. And I was really concerned about this. Firstly, that it was published in a social work journal that purports to support, ethics and values in social work, but also the fact that it was suggesting an action that was disruptive, that was interfering in a legal health service, that was wasting staff time and putting another barrier in the way by using an appointment that someone else could have had. So I was quite concerned about this, and in a way it was very motivating, because I wrote more and did more, and actually in the end wrote a couple of pieces for publication. Okay, so for me, I'm always, when I think about abortion, contraception, reproductive health in general, I like to think about three sort of ways of thinking about it. There's reproductive health care, which is about services. There's reproductive rights, which is about the legal framework in which those health services are created. And then there is reproductive justice, which is a much bigger picture, where we think about those three principles established by Ross in the work of Sister Song. The primary principles being the right not to have a child, the right to have a child, the right to parent children in a safe and healthy environment. Ross has argued for the necessary enabling conditions to realise these rights. So without the social structures, the social systems there to support parenting, for example, then it's harder for people to exercise their reproductive rights, those decisions about whether to have a child or not. So Loretta Ross talks about more of an intersectional approach to thinking about reproductive justice, that the ability of anyone to determine their reproductive destiny is linked to the conditions in the community. And that's not just a matter of individual choice and access. So it's not just about that legal framework and having services that exist. It's also about the barriers to accessing those services, the costs, the circumstances that anyone finds themselves in when they're pregnant, as to whether the social conditions are right for them to parent or whether they choose not to parent at this point in their life. But a lot of those things are directly impacted by the person's social position, their ability to have resources to access what they need in order to exercise their full choice. So Ross argues that the social realities, inequalities, particularly affect our ability to control our reproductive destiny. So what are the barriers and enablers of reproductive justice? Well, they're many and varied, and when I talk to students about this, they often initially kind of just think about these issues as, what's legal and what's not, what is available, what services are there out there, and what do I do as an individual social worker when I'm faced with somebody who wants to talk about abortion, for example, or access to contraception. So there are many barriers. I always start with talking about stigma and often finish with talking about stigma, because stigma underpins the sort of self-talk that happens for people considering their reproductive future. It also underpins discrimination. It may underpin the sort of lack of cultural safety for people who come with very many different belief systems and faiths into thinking about their reproductive choices, and the assumption that people are have either one set of views or another, without the impact of culture and ideology, faith, etc., is not helpful. There's a lack of responsiveness for people in poverty, people who are disabled, and people who live in rural or remote parts of our countries. Sometimes these barriers mean that people might manage their decisions, such as having an abortion, outside of the healthcare system. It may not be the unsafe back alley abortion. It may more often these days be using some kind of a route to a service through, activist groups. They may have to cross state lines or even fly to another country to get an abortion. But when they have to do these things, when the barriers mean that they can't access easily a safe and legal abortion, my question always is, do they get the support they need? Because so often in those situations, we enforce a kind of silence on them. They may feel that they have broken the law. They may feel that there will be consequences. They may be in situations where they are subject to some kind of coercive control. So they're often not able to talk about their experience. And the very experience, particularly for, say, a very young person, of having to travel a long way to access a healthcare service can be traumatizing in itself. So the other concerns that I raise as barriers are access issues related to protest. Despite the decriminalisation of abortion in many countries, protests still happen. And this can range from peaceful protests to physical harassment and abuse. And we have this in New Zealand, where we have legal services. There are still people who wish to protest outside abortion clinics. I have challenged people who are peacefully praying outside my nearest clinic, because I don't believe that praying at someone when they don't wish to be prayed at is peaceful. I think it's intrusive and it can be experienced as violence. And we all have the right to access health services without any intrusion whatsoever from members of the public who have their own personal views. Outside a legal health service is not the place to exercise that. There may also be stigma in relation to medical professionals' failure to refer or causing unnecessary delays. Lastly, the criminalisation of pregnancy, the punishment of pregnant people for actions interpreted as harmful to their pregnancies. And we have the bizarre situation in one state in the US where there is, intent to try and force some legislation through that would set up the death penalty for abortion. And I cannot think of anything more bizarre than claiming to be pro-life and then wanting to have the death penalty for people who have an abortion or who perform an abortion. I'll let that one sit there. So both the absence and the pursuit of reproductive justice are lived and viscerally felt by groups intersectionally, and those who are disproportionately subject to structural violence. Really excellent article by Gomez et al. So how do we support parenting or choosing not to parent in all of these situations, whether for Black, African American, Indigenous peoples, people of colour in many, many countries, for women who are poor, people who are homeless or rough sleeping, people who are queer and transgender, who may need to use services, who may face barriers to healthcare, may face prejudice and discrimination, to very young people who may be legally able to access an abortion, for example, but are very, very concerned about their well-being if they're unable to talk about this or get any support within their family or friend group. People who are migrants, people who are refugees, people who are incarcerated and institutionalized, who require cooperation from other people in order to access their reproductive health care, people who may be in coercive control situations or subject to intimate partner violence. And we know that reproductive coercion is a huge factor that's often under-researched. Again, people who live in rural or remote areas, people who are who have disabilities, people who have mental health challenges or use substances, all may face challenges in terms of exercising their reproductive choices. Just lost my cursor for a moment. There we go. So thank you for listening. I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of this webinar. There are many, many issues that we face, both as women, as all people who may be pregnant or may wish to start a family or may feel their family is complete. These matters concern social workers. You know, I've made a case for this being a social work issue, being an issue of social justice and human rights. So I hope everyone will go well. Kia kaha, be strong. Thank you again for listening, and best of luck to the other speakers in the seminar today. I can be contacted at ebeddoe@auckland.ac.nz, and I'm very happy to share the slides with the organisers later, or you can contact me directly if you would like to have a copy of any of the publications. So please do contact me if I can help in any way. At the end of the slides, I have the publications, some of the publications, and also some information about the podcasts, the various podcasts and media articles with some links there. So thank you very much. Great opportunity to be part of this, and I look forward to watching the full thing when it's recorded and made available by the organisers in due course. Go well, everyone. Take care.
Thank you so much, Liz Beddoe, for this intersectional human rights comprehensive overview of a social work perspective, and social work is obviously a human rights profession. Our third speaker is Minenhle from University of Johannesburg. Minenhle, if you have PowerPoints, you can share them.
Okay, all right, thank you so much. I'm going to project my presentation. I'm just going to pull it up. Please just let me know if you can see my screen.
We do.
Okay, perfect. All right, great, thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. My name is Minenhle. I am from the University of Johannesburg. Please let me know if I am audible.
You are.
Okay, perfect. Yes, I'm from the University of Johannesburg in South Africa, and I'm going to be presenting on a South African perspective of women's reproductive health rights and bodily autonomy. Okay, I would like to just start off by defining a key term that actually appears quite a bit in my presentation, and that is woman spelled with an X. And so this word is generally used to refer to women, but it is used especially in intersectional feminism as an alternative spelling to avoid the suggestion of sexism in the overall standard of spelling, which is usually perceived in the sequence of man or men. And this is also used to be inclusive of trans and non-binary women. So I just thought it would be fitting to start off with a definition before I actually move on to the rest of the presentation. Okay, so I'll start off by looking at reproductive control in apartheid South Africa. So I'll start off with a bit of a historical background and then the current trajectory of reproductive health in post-apartheid South Africa. And so on a more historical basis, okay, sorry, I got a notification. All right. On a historical basis, the state-sponsored South African Family Planning Program, which was developed in 1974, was promoted as a means to improve the health of women and their children. And so this program was actually implemented during the apartheid era, which I'm sure most of you may be aware that it was quite a separatist era. It was marred with separatist ideologies, segregatory policies, and overall discriminatory practices But during this period, the government implemented this family planning program, not necessarily on a racial basis, but it was available to any woman who sought these services, and they were free of charge. Although during this period, the government also acknowledged that the program was a way to place a check on the high population growth rate, which was said to be sort of burdening the limited resources that were available in the state. And also, this program was also widely linked with white fears of growing Black numbers at the time. And so when we look at the evolution of reproductive health rights in the post-apartheid South African era, in post-apartheid South Africa, sexual and reproductive health rights are therefore enshrined in Section 27 of the Constitution, which states that everyone has a right to healthcare services, including reproductive health care. And so policies such as the National Integrated Sexual and Reproductive Health Rights Policy are generally centered around this Section 27, which also then uses a rights-based approach to advocate for equitable access to reproductive services for all South Africans. And in the South African context, sexual and reproductive health means a state of physical, emotional, mental, and social well-being in relation to all aspects of sexuality and reproduction. So it is not only the absence of things like disease, dysfunction, or infirmity, but it is the overall well-being of the individual. And just to echo Jane's sentiments a bit earlier, as she rightly pointed out, reproductive health rights are indeed central to people's overall health and well-being, and they are a human right. And so over the years, work on sexual and reproductive health rights in South Africa has been focused on increasing things like access to contraception, improving infant and maternal health, as well as HIV and AIDS. And so notwithstanding the shortages that occur from time to time, it is quite commendable that the country and the government has made significant progress with access to contraception. So in public healthcare facilities, different contraceptive methods are accessible and they are free of charge for the larger majority of the population. These contraceptive methods are also accessible in conjunction with the necessary information to educate women on the various contraindications of each method. So there's also barrier methods in the form of your male and female condoms, which are accessible at these public healthcare facilities. And so it is also worth noting, though, that although these barrier methods are available in the form of male and female condoms, other barrier methods to include diverse sexualities, such as your dental derms, your lubrication, your finger derms, are not necessarily as easily accessible, and they need to be procured privately. So for people of diverse sexualities, it becomes quite a challenge to access these barrier methods, which are generally preventative measures, which form a critical part of sexual and reproductive health. And so regardless of the progressive sexual and reproductive health rights policies in the country, there is something to be said about inclusivity or the lack thereof when it comes to sexual and reproductive health rights. Additionally, there is quite a robust antiretroviral therapy program in South Africa. So the HIV program in the country is quite robust, and it is quite, largely spanned because it is accessible to people in public healthcare facilities and provides quite a large amount of support for people living with HIV. And this is quite fitting because South Africa has the highest HIV infection rate globally. According to a UNAIDS statistic in 2021, the country had over 7 million people living with HIV, of which that is quite a large number of the population. And of these people, about 18.3% account for the adult prevalence rate. And there is also an annual 210,000 new infections, which largely affects women, and it is growing by the day. It has been said that women between the ages 15 to 24 are at the highest risk of infection. And so it is quite fitting for this program to continue to remain in a robust manner, considering the fact that, the fight to reach the UNAIDS 95 targets, and the fight to end AIDS by 2030 is a continuous struggle. And so looking at South Africa's progress on sexual and reproductive health matters, even though South Africa has made great strides when it comes to sexual and reproductive health rights policies for the adult and adolescent women alike, there are quite a number of fundamental areas that have been neglected. And so the neglected areas include things like access to safe abortion. And a number of the colleagues on the call have spoken quite a bit about abortion laws in their different countries. And so in South Africa, what we find is that we have quite progressive policies, right? For instance, we've got the Choice on Termination of Pregnancy Act of 1996, which advocates for the accessibility and the availability of termination of pregnancy services. The issue with this is that access becomes the problem. So although we've got great policies in this regard on paper, accessibility becomes a challenge due to various bottlenecks in the public healthcare space. And so although the policy is great, the issue is the implementation of this policy and accessibility for your everyday South African who cannot afford to go to a private healthcare facility, for instance. Another neglected area is the free access to menstrual health products, and also the issue of gender-based violence, sexuality, and inclusion, amongst others. And so, as I mentioned a bit earlier, things like barrier methods are quite accessible, and they're widely spread, and people can get them free of charge. Although they may not be inclusive enough, but things like menstrual hygiene products are procured at a cost. There is no free sanitary pads, for instance, which is a need in a country like South Africa, where there's large amounts of poverty, large amounts of inequality, etc. And so these products in reality are quite expensive for individuals with no income. And as a result, approximately 7 million girls of school-going age still struggle to access these products. They are still forced to miss school, and they have to use towels and items of clothing during their menstrual cycle, which further exacerbates different types of infections and further marginalizes them. And this is also has a negative impact on their daily functioning. But not only that, it's also got a negative impact on their self-esteem, considering that menstruation is a choice. And yet we have free access to barrier methods, and yet engaging in sexual activity is indeed a choice. So this causes quite a mismatch in some of the policies and some of the things that policymakers are saying. For instance, we have a Ministry of Women and Children and People with Disabilities who have stated that free sanitary products are going to be available to young girls of school-going age in poor and marginalized communities since 2020. But realistically, the implementation of these things is still quite a problem even today. So normally what happens is that we will find our politicians going on podiums and stadiums and making promises on a menstrual hygiene day, but every other day when women are experiencing menstruation, we don't hear anything after that. So that is quite a challenge that is still, that still permeates South Africa today. So even more so, considering the amount of societal challenges which disproportionately affect women, menstruation and period poverty should not be one of them, but it continues to be a societal challenge. And so with regards to advocating for women's bodily autonomy and integrity, which is the last part of my presentation, women's reproductive health choices are constantly under scrutiny. This is a reality that we face in the country, and in present day South Africa, especially amongst the African population, Black women face a lot of stigma, a lot of judgment when making sexual and reproductive health choices that benefit them. And that goes to all women really in the country, depending on the context and the environment in which they come from. So this includes choices such as buying or carrying your own condoms. It includes choices such as getting contraception or making the choice to terminate a pregnancy. These choices are generally frowned upon, or they are discouraged, or they're even prohibited in cultural and religious communities. So what happens is that women are then imposed or exposed to an inferiority complex, which then affects how they choose to use their bodies or how they choose to make choices that benefit them in terms of their reproductive health rights. So while the legislation advocates for women's rights to bodily autonomy to a certain extent, cultural and religious stereotypes infringe on these rights to bodily autonomy and integrity. And it is also worth noting that for a long time, men have been key decision makers on female reproductive health matters, be it at a policy level or at a household level, and this needs to change. And so the movement advocating for bodily autonomy and integrity calls for women's ability to make their own decisions regarding their bodies. And it also works to prevent the need for third-party authorization in order to access sexual and reproductive health services. So bodily autonomy generally cuts across every right and every right violation, which is why it is important to respect and promote and protect women's rights to bodily autonomy and integrity in order to fully advance sexual and reproductive health rights in South Africa. And so this especially includes women at a grassroots level. These are women who are often excluded from such conversations, women sitting in rural environments, rural communities who do not have access to Zoom and YouTube and various online platforms. And so this is where the call for social workers comes in, that it becomes then our responsibility to reach these women, to empower these women and include them in such conversations. Help them understand their sexual and reproductive health rights, because most women do not know that they have rights when it comes to their own bodies, when it comes to making choices for their own bodies and their own health and well-being. And so in order to fully advance sexual and reproductive health rights for all women, it is important for us to include all women in the conversation. And in closing, I'd just like to echo the words of Michelle Obama, that there is no limit to what we as women can accomplish. I believe as long as we work together, there is a lot that we can change. The picture looks, bleak in some areas, positive in others, but I do believe that through these kinds of conversations and the extension of these conversations, a lot more can be done to improve women's sexual and reproductive health rights. I wish you all an advocative International Women's Day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minenhle Matea. I like it, advocative international women's rights. Very important work that you're doing, and all the best with your wonderful work. So unfortunately, we still have technical problems, so we will need to add the 2 videos of the other speakers that cannot access. We will add it later on when we will put everything online at the IASSW website. So you will be able in a few days access the full webinar. But I would like to take a few minutes to read out the IASSW Women's Interest Group and Human Rights Committee statement that we made related to the reproductive rights and abortion, the social work response. So we we are very much aware that access to a safe abortion has been declared an international human rights on many platforms. The need for abortions to be safe and accessible was supported by various states at the International Conference on Population and Development held in Cairo in 1994 and adopted by states in the Beijing Platform for Action, which was agreed at the 1995 Fourth World Conference on Women. In compliance with these commitments, laws about human rights should ensure that people's decision about their own body should be in their own control. Criminalizing abortion is discrimination against women. It stigmatizes people and, in addition, putting them at risk of increased reproductive health problems and at risk of death due to unsafe illegal abortions. Unsafe abortions can lead to physical and mental health complications, as well as social and financial burdens on individuals, communities, and health systems. In alignment with the right to life, health, and bodily integrity, states have an obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill women's rights to abortion services. Denying access to health services, including abortion, is discrimination and can constitute gender-based violence, torture, and/or cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. Today, we know that 25 million unsafe abortions take place each year, and the World Health Organization reports that currently about 45% of all abortions are unsafe, resulting in material deaths and illnesses that could be prevented. World Health Organization notes that lack of access to safe, timely, affordable, and respectful abortion care is a critical public health and human rights problem and poses risk to women's physical and mental well-being throughout the life course, and are the third leading cause of maternal deaths worldwide and lead to an additional 5 million largely preventable disabilities. In recent years, we have been confronted with varied and contradictory responses. On the one hand, more and more countries have legislated the right to safe abortion, for example, Ireland in 2018, and on the other hand, reproductive rights have been eroded in many other countries that had previously supported reproductive justice, not only in the USA, but also in some Eastern European countries. So what is the social work perspective? Social work educators need to advocate for sexual health, reproductive rights, and reproductive justice if they are to eliminate health and social inequalities. Sexual and reproductive health services for women need to be fully accessible and funded. Social workers should support any and all people making decisions related to when, how, and if to have a family, and provide unblasted support, accurate information, and appropriate referrals to people's needs. When abortion is restricted or denied, it harms all people, and the consequences can be catastrophic. People living with intersecting disadvantage are disproportionately impacted by access to safe and affordable abortions. And denying abortion rights leaves many individuals and families trapped in intergenerational cycles of poverty and disadvantage. Adverse consequences for these affected people include financial hardships, health complications, and other deleterious effects, such as the need to remain in an abusive relationship of poverty, which are likely to affect their child's well-being. Reproductive justice includes women's right to access various forms of reproductive rights, from access to gynecological clinic, reproductive education, free contraceptives, to the right to safe abortion. Social workers need to understand how to promote reproductive rights and reproductive justice at the individual and structural levels. Social workers need to understand and challenge the stigma of abortion and the trauma that can be experienced when having to have a legal abortion, which is further complicated in situations where illegal abortion is the only option. Social work educators need to address these issues when teaching social work and seeking transformative education, including sexual health, reproductive rights, and reproductive justice. They need to explore the difference between reproductive health and reproductive justice and pro-choice movements, including the barriers faced by social workers in promoting reproductive rights and reproductive justice. And to the end, critical social work educators need to undertake and/or support research which responds to reproductive rights and reproductive justice, for example, in challenging misinformation about abortion. It is imperative that social work educators address the misinformation that can present a significant barrier to safe, legal, and quality reproductive care, and use evidence-based research to fight for reproductive justice. So this is the statement that that was done, and we would like to use it as an International Association of the Schools of Social Work statement. And now we still have 20 minutes. If there are some discussions, questions, and the floor is yours, the speakers or the audience. Okay, any questions? I must say I was very pleased that Jane, that you showed us also how social workers already addressed the issues in scientific journals, and Minenhle, how comprehensive the issue is in the regions of Africa, as well as Liz. Some people are giving some comments. Thank you, Noret. So is there any other thoughts, comments to be added?
I just certainly appreciated hearing the other presentations and seeing, I think we do, as social workers, we really have to be aware of this sort of the intersectional approaches and the reproductive justice approach. I think, it does expand our lens and our understanding that it's a very large field. And if we really want to support women's, reproductive justice for all human beings, we need access, and all people need access to healthcare, but also a decent standard of living, and to live in a world without stigma, right? Like all of these, it has to come together. And sometimes we get stuck and we get siloed. And certainly, as I say, in the United States, I think that political pressures are very dangerous now in the world, not just in the US, as you're saying, Darja. Might be interesting to hear, you were speaking about in Southeastern Europe, you also see some rollbacks or some problems with access. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about that.
Mm-hmm. We know the most known example is Poland, and we know since 2016 women from Poland and are advocating and actually very much fighting for reproductive rights and the right for abortion. Probably you remember the so-called Black Mondays, when women came with the black umbrellas on the streets, and also men, and they actually wanted to get back the right for abortion, which women have since the 60s, 70s, during the communist period, and but also across all basically Eastern European post-socialist countries. For example, in former Yugoslavia, and Slovenia was part of it, the reproductive rights and the right for abortion was since the 50s. No. So in the 50s, there were social reasons for women who wanted to do the abortion, and then formally women really got the full access to abortion since the early 70s. So this was really early. But nevertheless, we have what Liz mentioned before. We have pressures, and women do experience this as violence. People who pray in front of gynecological clinics. A lot of international money is coming into the country to support pro-life organizations. The recent report says 70 million euro came in the last couple of years in the countries of Eastern Europe to support the organizations that want to ban abortion. So it's not that the society would somehow, and the people would forget what were good things during socialist communist period, and not, of course, they are mostly critical about what was bad, but there are intentionally international organizations that want to disrupt and ban this right. So I saw that Laura Guzmán Stein came from University of Costa Rica. So I'm really pleased, Laura, that that the technical barriers and obstacles were removed. So we are very happy to have you. And Laura, now I would like to give you the word. And if you have PowerPoints to share, we will make the possibilities that you can share the PowerPoints.
Well, finally made it. I don't know how, but I did it. No, I don't have any PowerPoint. So,
Okay.
Okay. So glad to be here. It was a bit hard, but got in finally. And I want to thank the International Association of Social Work Schools for sponsoring this webinar, and my colleagues on the committee for this organizational effort, in particular Darja's. This is a significant and strategic issue, not only for social work education and practice, but for women worldwide, since in many regions of the globe, conservative and authoritarian political leaders, governments, and transnational religious organizations, like, for example, in Latin America, the Catholic and Evangelical Protestant, among others, are fostering campaigns and other actions to reverse legislation and policies granting sexual and reproductive rights to women, gay and transgender populations, and other disenfranchised groups. I will take a few minutes to explain where I come from so you have a better understanding of my perspective. I am a feminist university educator and social worker with several decades of participation in the feminist and human rights movements, but also worked for 20 years at the Inter-American Institute on Human Rights as chair of the Gender and Human Rights and Civil Society department. Since the early 1970s, schools of social work in Latin America are committed to promoting human rights and empowering women. And since the 1980s, university schools of social work in Latin America were part of a strong movement fostered by the Latin American Association of Schools of Social Work to include in social work curricula with a critical human rights perspective capable of transforming cultural views and social relations at different levels. The School of Social Work at University of Costa Rica was one of the first to articulate this perspective in the curriculum at the three levels, the bachelor, the licenciatura, and the master social work programs. In a joint effort with the Inter-American Institute of Human Rights, the school implemented a training program in human rights education for social work faculty in Central America and South America and the Spanish Caribbean. The pedagogy sustaining this program is grounded on a critical perspective integrating theory and practice that question the formality of legal norms in our daily life experiences and how gender, class, and ethnicity cross our lives as individual members of a family and community, as social workers, educators, and students, in a profession where the majority of its members are women. In 1993, the UN International Conference on Human Rights in Vienna recognized the human rights of women and of the girl child are inalienable, integral, and indivisible part of universal human rights. The full and equal participation of women in political, civil, economic, social, and cultural life at the national, regional, and international levels, and the eradication of all forms of discrimination on grounds of sex are priority objectives of the international community. Quote. This was a recognition that the women's rights are human rights, including sexual and reproductive rights, such as the right to life, liberty, and the security of a person, the right to health care and information, the right to get pregnant, and the right to have or not to bear children, and the right to non-discrimination in the allocation of resources to health services and in their availability and accessibility, among others. However, worldwide, there are many women and girls denied the human rights they are entitled to simply because they are women and they are girls. When society recognizes a right, social relations are affected. Rights are rules determining how we relate to others, facilitating or restricting behaviors. Human rights need to be recognized, but for most, practiced on a daily basis in the context of relationships grounded on the belief that others are equals. This is the foundation of the principle of equality. When we apply this premise to the rights of women, we end up discovering that society seldom complies with this rule. This explains why our human rights are systematically weakened, openly questioned, and subjected to fierce public controversies, such as in the case of abortion. Basic rights such as the right to education, health, economic independence, political rights, and equal opportunities imply all human beings are equal. However, in daily life, this does not happen with women and other excluded populations. Recognition of sexual and reproductive rights of women questions the symbolic and real framework developed around masculine appropriation of women's bodies and is a clear evidence of the injustice of a social order established in women's subordination. This explains why abortion, or voluntary interruption of pregnancy, generates fierce resistance at many levels in all countries of Latin America, leading to political alliances among groups with extreme ideologies, but converging when the right to abortion is on the agenda. Alliances between political groups, governments, the Catholic Church, and evangelical groups are becoming more common in contesting laws providing women with reproductive and sexual liberties and supporting campaigns against feminism, and gay and trans rights. Governments are enforcing policies where public workers have to comply with conservative interpretations of legal norms, as it happens with therapeutic abortion norms in criminal codes, manipulation of pregnant women not to terminate pregnancy even when the life of a mother is at risk. Social workers who do not comply because of ethical social work considerations are facing threats and risks in a labor context where colleagues work under strict procedures and schedules and many lack tenure. Latin American countries have some of the most restrictive abortion laws in reproductive health because the right to reproductive autonomy is not recognized fully as a fundamental human right. However, and in spite of these restrictions, Latin American women continue to demand reproductive health services. These laws are forcing women to risk their lives and health when having illegal, unsafe abortions. Latin America has one of the highest rates of maternal death in the world because of unsafe abortions. This reality has stimulated movements towards liberalizing abortion laws and having states comply with international human rights responsibilities. We have 22 countries in the Latin American region, and only 7 have decriminalized abortion. 5 criminalized abortions at any stage of pregnancy, and 10 have laws with a few norms permitting abortions when the life or health of the mother is at risk, of the woman is at risk, or in case of rape and incest. Instead of advancing towards more liberal laws on this matter, the push in several countries is towards fully criminalizing abortion and limiting certain reproductive health policies. This is the case of countries like Costa Rica and others, a few others in Latin America, where we have some norms that permit abortion, especially when the health of the mother is at risk. And right now there's a bill in Congress to criminalize 100% abortion. Social workers and social work educators face many challenges in contexts of this nature. As practitioners and educators, we need to understand that advocating for reproductive rights has an impact on the range of choices available to women. Although women's control over their own bodies is critical to women's own selfhood, the issue of reproductive rights challenges patriarchal power over women's life choices. Engagement in processes of this nature create critical awareness of how these choices affect women demanding reproductive health services, as well as the social workers providing the services. Social workers acknowledge that the decision to bear children has profound social implications. However, women's bodies must not be fought over in the struggle among states, religions, males, head of households, and private corporations. The success of reproductive health programs is dependent upon empowerment of women and programs taking into account women's needs and interests, as well as how patriarchal culture and religion contribute to gender subordination. Women must be actively involved in the conceptualization, formulation, and implementation stages to promote reproductive rights and reproductive justice, and to be able to strengthen these competencies in practitioners and in students of social work. We need to make changes in the curriculum to make it possible. Coercion of poor women on social assistance must not be allowed. Reproductive rights assures attention to the person and the social context in which decisions are made. In order to contribute to the elimination of health and social inequality, social workers and social work educators need to advocate for sexual and reproductive health services, including safe and affordable abortions, free and safe contraceptives, reproductive education, and legal and social empowerment. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you so much, Laura Guzmán. This was so important. And it reminds us that the struggle continues, that the 8th of March has to be a celebration, but also not only sharing flowers and sweets, but also women's stories and doing advocacy and reminding ourselves that social work is a human rights profession, and that we do need to share experiences from across the globe to see how to improve the conditions in the area of reproductive health and justice for all people who need it and them, and that we need to, that social work as a profession, academia, as well as social workers, have to get involved in these discussions. So thank you very much. Is there any other questions, comments that anyone wish to make? If not, I thank you so much to those who participated actively. Thank you for your wonderful contributions. Thank you to everyone who attended the webinar, and thank you, Jane, Minenhle, and Laura, and Liz, and the access to the whole webinar. We hope we will be able to upload also the fifth person who was not able to come, Professor Raewyn Connell, and then everything will be accessible on website of IASSW. Have a wonderful International Women's Day tomorrow. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Cheers. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.